By noon, a mild morning has turned into the children's blizzard. Across Nebraska and Dakota, a cold front drops temperatures in minutes and drives fine snow on winds over 35 miles per hour, with gusts strong enough to lift light roofs and scour open country. Later accounts will put the toll at well over 200 dead, most of them children caught between one building and the next. Newspapers record claim shanties and barns losing their roofs in a single gust. Sod houses with heavy coverings survive more often, but leak and sag. Some farmers string wire tie-downs over boards. Others pile brush or stack hay as a windbreak. A few have planted low rows of trees. The contrast is simple but brutal. Same storm, different failure rates. This story follows the numbers behind that difference, how roof pitch, eave length, nail spacing, and one low, porous wind-slip fence, upwind, could turn a 60-mile-per-hour battering into a survivable 40-mile-per-hour load. Custer County, Nebraska, and Eastern Dakota Territory, 1873 through 1883. Inside a homestead claim shanty, frost coats the interior walls. A tin bucket placed near the stove holds water frozen solid at the rim. Light snow drifts across the packed earth floor where gaps in the roof let weather through. The structure is framed lumber, an improvement over the dugout or tent most families begin with. But improvement does not mean security. The assumption across the homestead belt is straightforward. Once a family graduates from earth shelter to a proper frame building with boards and shingles, they have left the most fragile phase behind. The outcome tells a different story. Light-framed roofs with long eaves prove vulnerable in every serious gale, while some crude sod structures simply sit through the wind. The Homestead Act of 1862 and later timber culture entries bring families into a treeless region where lumber must be hauled from distant mills or shipped by rail at considerable cost. County historians and surveyors documenting the sod house phenomenon in Custer County and similar districts record what settlers build when wood is scarce and wind is not. A typical sod house uses blocks cut 3 to 4 inches thick, 12 to 16 inches wide, and 24 inches long. Walls rise in 2 courses, roughly 24 to 27 inches total thickness, with staggered joints and occasional bond layers for stability. The mass resists horizontal wind well. A typical frame claim shanty measures 20 by 30 feet in plan. Light 2-inch framing supports plank sheathing, tar paper, and eventually shingles once sawmill supply allows. Roof assemblies vary, sod laid directly on poles and planks, or plank decks with tar paper and 3/4 to 1-inch shingles. Eaves project 12 to 18 inches to throw rain clear of sod walls and protect the base. Prevailing winter winds blow frequently at 30 to 40 miles per hour with higher gusts from the northwest across the open plains. Later, climatologies for Dakota and Wyoming document this pattern as consistent and unrelenting. Frontier construction notes and preservation briefs stress that sod walls resist horizontal wind effectively, but roofs, especially sod roofs laid on inadequate framing, are heavy, leak-prone, and at risk of failure if underbuilt. The paradox emerges clearly in the records. On a prairie with almost no timber, the cheapest walls, blocks of sod stacked by hand, often outlast the more expensive roofs laid on top of them. The cause and effect chain is mechanical. Treeless terrain forces settlers into either earth-heavy sod walls and roofs or imported light framing. Where lumber is scarce, roofs are thinned and overhangs lengthened to improve water shedding. That geometry, thin deck, long eaves, offers the wind an easy grip. In repeated storms, shingle edges lift and nail holes wallow out. What looks like a finished structure reveals itself as a structure on trial every time the wind rises. Representative Farms near rail stops in Wyoming Territory, Dakota Territory, and central Nebraska, 1875 through 1887. A row of 8-foot board fence stands tight against the wind. Every plank is nailed edge to edge, creating a solid wall meant to stop the gale. The fence creaks under steady pressure. Beyond it, a hat tumbles end over end across open pasture, unchecked. The assumption guiding most builders is simple. You fight wind with mass. More boards, heavier roofing, taller fences as close to the house as possible. Agricultural bulletins and builders' handbooks recommend heavier roofing, doubled shingle layers, and plenty of nails as the cure for blow-offs. Local histories note churches and barns unroofed by gales despite being strongly built. The outcome contradicts the assumption. Heavy roofs and tall, tight fences sometimes increase the forces on the eaves instead of reducing them. Standard shanty dimensions follow predictable patterns. A 20 by 30-foot plan yields roughly 600 square feet of roof area. Common pitch runs 6 and 12, a moderate slope that sheds water without requiring excessive rafter length. Shingle exposure measures 4 to 5 inches per course, with each course overlapping the one below. Hardware consists of 6 penny to 8 penny cut nails, typically spaced 6 to 8 inches apart at each shingle course. Some carpenters crowd nails at ridges and gable ends, but use fewer at the eaves, reasoning that the interior courses bear more weight. Yard fencing follows similar conventional logic. 6 to 8 foot plank fences are erected 10 to 15 feet from the house walls, built nearly solid for privacy and wind stopping. The boards are set vertical or horizontal, tight enough that light barely passes through. Simple load mathematics reveals the problem. At 60 miles per hour, dynamic pressure on a flat plate reaches approximately 20 to 25 pounds per square foot. Concentrated at eave lines and corners, that becomes hundreds of pounds of uplift on a small area. The smooth underside of roof sheathing and the wide eave lip act like an inverted wing. Air accelerates beneath the overhang, creating suction. Tall, solid fencing just in front of the wall forces streamlines up and over in a tight arc, focusing uplift at the eave rather than diffusing it. The fence intended to protect becomes a ramp that aims wind at the weakest part of the roof. Historical home building guidance warns that shallow pitch or excessive projection can let wind get under and lift the roof. Modern shingle and preservation manuals echo that concern, noting that eave and ridge lines are the primary failure points in high wind events. Despite extra lumber and nails, roofs still fail at the same edge points. Every additional inch of overhang buys a little more shade and rain protection, and gives the wind a longer lever to pry with. Selected storms across Nebraska and Dakota, 1880 through 1887. Plains ranches and town fringes. After a January gale, a farmer walks his property line. In the snow, 20 yards from his barn, lies a section of ridge cap, flipped upside down. The cap is still nailed to a continuous strip of shingles and decking, torn cleanly from the peak. The barn itself stands, but the roof is compromised. Repair will consume days and lumber the family can barely afford. The assumption persists. The safest yards will be the ones most enclosed, solid fences, barns close to the house, no gaps in the protective perimeter. Damage maps assembled after repeated storms show the opposite. Structures tucked behind terrain features, brush lines, or low natural banks often keep their roofs when fenced compounds do not. Newspaper editors list storm damage county by county, barns unroofed, churches losing steeples, shanties flattened or rendered uninhabitable. The language is matter-of-fact, the pattern consistent. Indigenous practice offers a contrast. Dakota, Pawnee, and other groups site winter lodges behind natural banks and brush rather than erecting tall board walls. Ethnographic sources describe this as deliberate placement, not accident. Long-range stockmen accept open, scattered layouts with low dugouts and sod shelters instead of walled compounds. Their infrastructure survives storms that strip settled farms. Ad hoc adaptations emerge across the Homestead belt. Roof tie-downs, wires or ropes thrown over roofs and anchored to buried posts or rocks, appear in sod house histories. Storm lines, ropes strung between buildings for people to follow in whiteout, become standard on exposed claims. Brush piles and straw stacks are placed upwind, partly by convenience, partly from observation that they change how wind moves around the yard. Sod house surveys note that in tornadoes and strong straight-line winds, sod walls often remain standing even if roofs and outbuildings are lost. The walls, built from compacted earth with roots still binding the blocks, resist lateral forces that splinter light framing. The roofs, whether sod or shingle, fail under uplift and suction at the edges. Even without formulas, some settlers and indigenous communities observe that low, irregular, porous barriers change how snow and wind lay around camp or farmstead. Tall, tight fencing shows a different pattern. Scoured earth near the fence, steep drifts and strong gusts just beyond. The wind does not stop. It concentrates. The more effort families put into stopping the wind outright, the more often the eaves, not the walls, pay the price. The pattern is visible in every yard after a blow, but nobody has yet written it down as design. Late 1870s through the 1880s, mainline grades in Wyoming and Dakota Territories. A section crew walks the right-of-way after a storm. Snow has piled in a smooth, shallow bank far downwind of a slatted fence. The rails themselves remain nearly clear. The crew chief notes the outcome in his logbook. Fence performing as designed, track serviceable without additional clearing. The assumption among early railroaders is straightforward. The best way to protect a track from drifting is a solid wall that blocks snow entirely. Field tests over multiple winters show the opposite. Slatted fences with roughly 50% porosity outperform solid barriers in drift control. Railroad engineers and maintenance-of-way supervisors publish performance data as the tests accumulate. Standard wood snow fences stand approximately 4 feet tall with boards and gaps alternating to achieve around 50% open area. The spacing is deliberate, not decorative. A field rule evolves. Major drifts form within a zone, extending from a few fence heights to several dozen fence heights downwind. The exact distance depends on wind speed, snow texture, and terrain, but the pattern is consistent. Porous fences reduce wind speed behind them, promoting deposition in a controlled zone. Solid fences cause turbulence, creating short, steep drifts immediately behind the barrier and scour elsewhere. Design notes compiled by railroad departments state plainly that the best fence porosity is 40 to 50% for effective and economical snow control. Higher porosity, closer to 70 or 80%, provides less shelter. Lower porosity approaches the behavior of a solid wall with turbulence and unpredictable drift patterns. The cause and effect chain is economic as well as mechanical. Railroads pay to experiment with different fence densities and setback distances, because keeping tracks clear determines whether trains run. Their results prove that letting wind partially through a barrier generates more predictable, usable shelter than trying to block it completely. Those same principles can be scaled to a house instead of a track. The geometry is different, but the physics are identical. By 1900, the railroad has hard numbers showing that half a wall of boards can do more work than a full one. The lesson is available to anyone who asks, but most homesteaders never think to ask a railroad engineer about fences. Great Plains Homesteads under Timber Culture and Homestead Acts, 1873 through 1890. A homesteader paces the northern boundary of his claim, driving stakes every 10 feet. Between the stakes, he plants cottonwood saplings in 2 parallel rows, spacing them to allow growth. The saplings are barely thicker than a man's thumb. In 5 years, they will stand 15 feet tall. In 10, they will form a continuous screen. The Timber Culture Act of 1873 grants an additional 160 acres to settlers who plant 40 acres in trees and maintain them for a specified period. The law is designed to address multiple goals: timber supply, erosion control, and speculative theories about rainfall. Shelter around buildings is treated as a side benefit. The outcome exceeds expectations in one respect. Rows of trees become de facto wind-slip systems, reducing wind, fuel use, and mechanical wear on buildings. Federal policymakers pass the act with broad environmental ambitions. Plains farmers respond by planting poplar, cottonwood, and other fast-growing species in belts around fields and homesteads. The trees serve multiple purposes: fuel, fencing material, shade, but their effect on wind becomes undeniable within a decade. Modern Natural Resources Conservation Service and Forest Service analysts later quantify windbreak benefits using controlled studies. Windbreak layouts typically consist of 2 to 3 rows spaced several feet apart, achieving overall density around 40 to 60% when in leaf. This density matches the effective porosity proven by snow fence research. Documented effects are substantial. Properly designed farmstead windbreaks can reduce home heating fuel consumption by 10 to 30%. A Natural Resources Conservation Service technical note states plainly, recent studies show that windbreaks can reduce winter fuel consumption by 10 to 30%. A Forest Service publication adds that if wind is reduced, you will use at least 15% less home fuel. The cause and effect chain runs through multiple variables. Laws incentivize tree planting for reasons unrelated to aerodynamics. Settlers respond by lining fields and yards with fast-growing species. Over time, observation and later measurements confirm that these belts significantly reduce wind at the house line and cut heating costs. The physics, porous barrier, distance, height to setback ratio, match snow fence behavior precisely. A few rows of fast-growing cottonwood, planted for timber and shade, quietly do more for roofs than another half-inch of shingle thickness ever could. Analytical reconstruction, circa 1885 homestead on open ground near a Iaa, Wyoming or Dakota rail siding. Modern wind data from the same belt inform the analysis. A surveyor's chain stretches across bare ground. One end anchors at a house corner. The other end marks a point 30 feet upwind, roughly one building height away. Stakes driven at intervals outline where a low fence will stand. The assumption guiding most builders is that fences belong close in, defining the yard perimeter and creating a visible boundary. The outcome, when wind behavior is analyzed, suggests the opposite. The most effective wind-slip fences sit 1 to 2 house heights upwind, not hugging the wall line. Modern engineers combine 19th century building practice with snow fence and windbreak research to propose a historically plausible layout. The reconstruction uses only materials and techniques available in the 1880s, scaled to match documented dimensions from surviving structures. Fence height in this system, 4 to 5 feet, roughly chest high to an adult. Porosity, 50 to 60%, achieved by spacing 4 to 5 inch boards with 1.5 to 2 inch gaps. Setback, 1 to 2 building heights upwind of the house, approximately 20 to 40 feet for a cabin with a 20-foot ridge height. Bottom gap, 12 to 18 inches open initially. Over winter, snow, tumbleweeds, and chaff gradually pack against the base, slightly tightening the fence as the season progresses. Materials required are modest. Short boards, lighter posts, and recycled planks from older structures cost less than building a full 8-foot stockade. Labor is comparable, fewer posts to set, shorter boards to handle, but more care in spacing and alignment. Snow fence guides recommend 40 to 50% porosity and fixed setback distances to maximize sheltered zones. The principle translates directly to homestead scale. A low, porous fence slows and thickens the oncoming flow, creating a wind-slip zone where gusts are weaker and less turbulent. By the time air reaches the wall and eaves, effective speed is reduced well below free stream conditions. This directly cuts uplift and suction at critical roof edges. In lumber, the difference between a stockade and a wind-slip fence is a few inches of board. In pressure at the eave, it can be half. Sod and frame houses documented in Nebraska, Kansas, and Wyoming, 1880 through 1900. The Dow's sod house provides a later but well-recorded example. A carpenter kneels at the edge of a roof, driving an 8-penny nail through overlapping shingles at the first course. He sets a small bent tin clip over the exposed edge, securing it with another nail. The clip is crude, cut from scrap sheet metal and bent by hand, but it performs a specific function. It locks the shingle edge against uplift. The assumption among most builders is that evenly spaced nails and identical overhangs on all sides make for a balanced roof. Records and modern guidance both show that extra, fasteners, and shorter eaves at windward edges sharply improve survival. Carpenters and homesteaders adopt improved patterns as they see where roofs fail. Preservationists specifying shingle and eave details for historic structures in high wind zones draw from these same lessons. Technical briefs note that wood shingle roofs are most vulnerable at ridges and eaves, and that good fastener practice there is critical to wind performance. Edge nailing becomes standard among experienced builders. Nails are placed every 4 to 5 inches at the first 3 courses from the eave and at the ridge. Field spacing remains 6 to 8 inches, adequate for normal loads. The concentration of fasteners at the edges raises the threshold wind speed for first shingle loss. Overhang reductions follow similar logic. Eaves are pulled back to 6 to 8 inches on windward sides where possible, while leeward sides retain longer projection for water management. The asymmetry looks odd but performs reliably. Mechanical aids are simple and within period capability. Tin clips, cut from scrap and nailed over shingle edges, provide physical restraint. 1x3 storm battens nailed at the underside of eaves add another layer of security. Wire tie-downs thrown over the entire roof and anchored to stakes or buried logs appear in sod house documentation as a last resort measure for extreme exposure. The cause and effect chain is direct. Concentrating material and fastening at the windward edge raises the threshold wind speed for first shingle loss. In a given storm, a roof with disciplined edge detailing may lose a few shingles. A roof with long eaves and sparse nailing may lose entire panels. On paper, it is only a handful of extra nails per course. In the storm ledger, it is the difference between patching and rebuilding. Freight depots and general stores along the Union Pacific and Burlington routes, 1880s through 1890s. A storekeeper opens his ledger to a customer's account. The columns list fencing boards, posts, and roofing nails purchased over the past 3 years. Beside each entry, freight charges appear, often matching or exceeding the cost of the lumber itself. At the bottom of the page, a note in pencil: shingles, storm damage, 3rd time. The assumption driving most purchasing decisions is that settlers show prudence and strength by pouring scarce lumber into visibly solid fences and thick roofs. The outcome, when total labor, repairs, and risk are accounted for over a decade, suggests the opposite. The half fence and tuned roof edge are cheaper. Storekeepers tally repeated purchases of shingles and nails after each major storm. Some customers appear after every gale, buying replacement materials. Others return rarely, if at all. Early insurance agents and county assessors note recurring roof losses on some properties and not on others. The pattern is not random. Board-foot arithmetic reveals the trade-off. 100 feet of 8-foot solid fence consumes approximately 800 board feet of planks. A 4-foot fence with 50% porosity running 200 feet in length uses a similar volume, but changes how wind approaches the house. Labor calculations follow. Digging post holes, hauling planks, and reshingling after repeated failures add up to more total effort than building a single wind-slip fence plus occasional patching. Natural Resources Conservation Service and highway research conducted decades later show that snow fences and windbreaks are dramatically cheaper over time than repeated mechanical removal or repairs. Similar economics apply at farmstead scale, even if no one calculates the figures explicitly in the 1880s. The cause and effect chain runs through immediate psychology versus long-term ledger math. Tall, close fences look protective. They visibly consume material and labor, signaling investment. But ledger math spread across 10 to 15 winters favors designs that reduce peak loads and maintenance cycles, even if they appear less robust at first glance. Families pay freight on every extra board in a tall fence, and then pay again when that same fence helps lift their roof. The wind extracts its cost either way. The question is whether the cost comes as prevention or repair. 12th and 13th of January, 1888. Great Plains from Montana to Nebraska. Inside a claim shanty, a kerosene lantern flickers. The flame bends horizontal. Gutters, nearly dies. Outside, the wind rises with unnatural speed. What began as a mild morning transforms within hours into the children's blizzard, a storm that will kill more than 200 people, most of them children caught between schoolhouse and home. Weather observers and later analysts describe temperatures falling from just above freezing to far below zero within hours. Fargo records negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit with strong winds. Snow driven on sustained winds above 35 miles per hour, with gusts stronger, reduces visibility to near zero. The snow is fine and powdery, ideal for penetrating any gap in a structure. Local histories recount barns, schoolhouses, and light frame buildings losing roofs in the storm. Contemporary accounts emphasize the terrible hard wind like a hurricane and visibility of 3 steps from the door at best. Some families huddle for warmth as roofs tear away overhead. Others find their structures intact but choked with drifted snow that forces its way through every seam and crack. Structural outcomes follow predictable patterns. Tall, light buildings with long eaves and no meaningful windbreak suffer the worst roof failures. Sod and earth-sheltered houses usually keep their walls and often their roofs, though water infiltration and interior drifting are serious problems. The rapid frontal passage creates strong pressure gradients, maximizing uplift at eaves. Any geometry that lets wind slip under the roof, edge, long overhangs, no upwind barrier to bleed speed, converts that gradient into physical tear-off. Shingles lift, nails pull, decking separates. In the worst cases, entire roof panels peel away as single units, still nailed together, leaving families exposed to sub-zero cold and blinding snow. The blizzard provides more structural testing in less than 24 hours than a decade of ordinary winters. Every weakness built into a roof, every shortcut taken in fencing or fastening reveals itself under stress. Survivors will remember not just the cold and the tragedy, but the clear division between structures that held and those that failed. The blizzard that takes hundreds of lives also leaves a pattern in broken roofs and intact ones for anyone willing to read it. Analytical reconstruction set against 1888 through 1895 winter records across the Central Plains. 3 simplified sketches hang side by side. Each shows a house in plan view with different fence configurations. The first, 8-foot solid fence 10 to 15 feet from the wall. The second, no fence, clean exposure. The third, 4 to 5 foot porous fence 20 to 40 feet upwind. The assumption underlying most homestead layouts is that the most enclosed, fortress-like arrangement should fare best in extreme wind. The outcome, when identical wind assumptions are applied to each configuration, shows the opposite. The most enclosed layout generates the highest roof loads. The least intuitive design, low, porous, distant fence, performs best. Modern structural and wind engineers apply snow fence and windbreak equations to homestead geometries using documented historical dimensions and wind speeds. Three cases emerge. Case 1. Tall fence close, 8-foot solid fence at 10 to 15 feet from the wall. 12 to 18-inch eave projection, standard nailing with 6 to 8-inch spacing. Wind forced up and over with tight radius creates high suction at the eave. Frequent shingle loss. Panels peeling in sustained gusts above 50 miles per hour. Case 2. No fence. Clean exposure with no barrier. Wind hits wall and roof directly. Loads are high, but flow is simpler. Outcomes depend heavily on nailing quality and overhang length. Moderate failures under stress. Some roofs survive, others do not. Case 3. Wind slip. 4 to 5 foot porous fence with 50 to 60% porosity at 20 to 40 feet upwind. Eaves cut back to 6 to 8 inches. Dense edge nailing and clips at critical courses. Using snow fence data, engineers estimate 30 to 50% wind speed reduction at the house line. Uplift roughly halved compared to Case 1. Failures rare under the same wind conditions that strip other roofs. Technical sources state that windbreak fences should aim for large reductions in wind velocity, 75% in some designs, and that effect depends on density and height. At constant free-stream speed, roof performance becomes a question of local speed at the eave, controlled by barrier design and distance. The odd-looking low fence at distance, plus tuned roof edge, systematically shifts structures from failure to survival under the same storm. From the standpoint of forces at the eave, the half fence can be worth more than another layer of shingles. Early 1940s, Custer County, Nebraska. The Dow's sod house. A tornado cuts across Custer County. When it passes, every outbuilding on the Dow's homestead lies in ruins. The barn is gone, sheds are matchsticks, fences are scattered, but the sod house itself stands largely intact. Descendants and historians describe the event, the storm that destroyed everything except the house. A tornado should not spare a sod farmhouse while wrecking barns. The expectation is that anything in the path will be damaged or destroyed. The outcome defies that expectation and reinforces lessons from earlier decades. The Dow's house features sod walls 24 to 36 inches thick. The roof is shingled with relatively short eaves. The house sits low in the landscape, presenting a minimal profile. Outbuildings, by contrast, are lighter frame construction with higher walls and more exposed profiles. Though the house was not designed as a wind-slip system by any formal method, the combination of mass, low profile, and surrounding features approximates its effects. The National Register description notes the tornado and the survival of the sod house versus outbuildings. The event becomes part of local memory, cited as evidence that old methods had merit beyond nostalgia. The principle remains consistent across contexts. Low, massive, aerodynamically quiet structures combined with partially shielded exposures survive shocks that strip lighter, more exposed buildings. The Dow's house embodies that principle accidentally, but the result is the same as if it had been planned. Decades after the Homestead era, one sod house quietly proves what the numbers had been suggesting all along. The wind does not respect intention or effort. It responds only to geometry, mass, and the path of least resistance. Structures that present smooth, low profiles and avoid creating concentrated pressure zones survive. Structures that challenge the wind with height and sharp edges pay the price. The torn sawhorse lying in the yard tells the story in miniature. Light, angular, exposed, destroyed. The sod wall behind it, thick and earthbound, stands untouched. Great Plains from Nebraska to Wyoming, 1900 through late 20th century. A highway curves through open country. On the windward side, 2 rows of mature conifers stand parallel to the road. Snow drifts smoothly in the field beyond, but the pavement remains clear. The trees function as a living snow fence, their spacing and density calculated to achieve specific aerodynamic effects. The assumption persists into the modern era that scientific windbreak design is a recent invention born of controlled studies and advanced theory. The outcome shows otherwise. Later programs formalize and scale principles already present in ad hoc fences, brush lines, and tree rows on homesteads. The United States Forest Service and partner agencies promote plains shelterbelts beginning in the 1930s and continuing through the century. State Departments of Transportation and the Natural Resources Conservation Service use slatted and living snow fences along highways to manage drift and reduce maintenance costs. Shelterbelts are specified with target densities of 40 to 60%, distances from protected features tuned to height. Design principles emphasize porosity, setback, and height as primary variables, echoing railroad snow fence practice from 50 years earlier. United States Department of Agriculture and Forest Service documents describe the Timber Culture Act as the most conspicuous act in tree planting history and note shelterbelt roles in wind and snow control. The act, passed in 1873 with broad environmental goals, inadvertently seeded a distributed network of windbreaks that reduced fuel use, protected structures, and stabilized soil. Local craft-level observation, brush piles, low fences, tree rows planted by trial and error, evolves into formal state and federal programs. Measured success of these systems in reducing snowdrift and building loads validates the old half-fence logic at larger scale. By mid-century, highway departments and foresters are quietly building giant versions of the same porous fence that once looked wrong in a single homestead yard. The wind slip principle, whether named or not, becomes standard conservation practice across millions of acres. Present day, Central Plains. Comparative view over 140 years of storms, from the 1888 blizzard to modern winter records. Two identical houses sit on a test plot. One stands exposed. The other shelters behind a properly designed windbreak. Anemometers record wind speed at both locations during the same gust. The exposed house sees 60 miles per hour. The protected house sees 40. The difference is not subtle. The assumption in modern construction is that advanced materials and techniques alone solve the wind problem. The outcome, measured in energy bills and damage statistics, still shows measurable benefits from correctly placed porous barriers, just as on the 19th century homestead. Researchers reviewing United States windbreak studies find heating energy savings in northern states commonly range from 10 to 25% with good windbreaks in place. Typical winter winds on the Central Plains still reach 40 to 60 miles per hour in many events. Recommended windbreak design maintains porosity around 40 to 60%, height sufficient to cast a wind shadow across buildings, and setbacks tuned to a multiple of barrier height. Documented reductions in fuel use and building maintenance occur where such designs are in place. Contemporary windbreak guides state plainly, if wind is reduced, your home will be more comfortable, and you will use at least 15% less home fuel. The language is direct, the claim conservative. Field measurements often show higher savings. From children's blizzard accounts to modern energy audits, the same pattern repeats. Structures that bleed and bend the wind fare better than those that try to stop it outright. The wind slip fence concept, low, porous, offset, sits at the center of that pattern, whether applied to a single homestead or a regional conservation program. On a landscape where winter winds still routinely reach 40 to 60 miles per hour, the most durable houses have never been the ones that tried to block the wind, but the ones that made sure it arrived tired at the eaves.